It's with great privilege of mine to introduce Vermont's own Bill McKibben, one of the world's most knowledgeable, articulate, and committed climate action crusaders. Bill's gonna, I think, set a sobering picture of where we're at. And this is not his first rodeo. Bill penned, I think, the first book for a general audience on climate change many years ago. His understanding of the climate science is real. More so, the political and sort of public, people-centered framework about what we need to do and why is also real. So Bill made his way from Burlington early this morning, where he was joining our own Senator Bernie Sanders and others thinking about how do we tackle this crucial issue and others. So I just want to say thank you so much for making the time. It's Bill's first time here, and I'm just deeply grateful.
Excellent. What a pleasure to be here. So, my old friend Joey is short and enthusiastic, and I'm tall and depressive, and my job for the day is simply to dig you the hole from which you will then have to climb for the next several hours. It really is a pleasure to be here. I've known an awful lot of people in this room for a long time. I've known Joey forever. There's, nobody who works harder and more indefatigably cheerfully than she on this work. Many thanks especially to VNRC for just kind of being the backbone of so many important things that go on in this state and kind of providing the space around which it coalesces. A pleasure to meet your new colleague, Ian, who I gather I've met before because we were in jail once long ago together. You meet a lot of good people in jail, is my experience. Look, I'm gonna, my only real instruction is just to make sure I'm done by 10 so you can actually get to real work. So I'm gonna, maybe you'll indulge me in looking at a few pictures from my summer vacation first, just to get things started here. I was actually doing some organizing in Greenland, and it was a completely remarkable trip. Greenland is an amazing place. When you get up there and see the giant ice shelf, you have a kind of visceral sense for what's going on, and you also have a visceral sense for how quickly it's melting. We were on a boat on the way to this fjord. You can see the picture isn't that you can see there's open water out in front of the boat. In fact, there was open water for miles around. But I was looking up at the electronic chart above the captain's wheel, and you can see there that the icon for the boat makes it clear that we're a mile inland on dry land. And with mild alarm, I asked the captain to explain this, and he laughed and said, "Oh well, the chart's 5 years old. 5 years ago, it was all ice as far as you can see now here, but no more." We were up there doing this remarkable project where we brought. Something I'd long wanted to do, and I brought a couple of poets. The woman in the grass skirt is a woman named Kathy Jetnil Kajiner from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, a wonderful poet, and I wanted to get her up there to perform one of her poems, standing on the ice that when it melted would drown her home. I figured that was sort of one way to kind of get this across. And she recruited the other woman, Akaniviana, a Greenlandic native, whose, of course, homeland is being changed every single day as the ice melts away from it. And you can watch their poem on YouTube. Millions of people have seen it now, and it really is quite dramatic and powerful. And yes, there we are. I don't know whether this video is gonna play or not. What do you think, Ian?
I hope so.
How do I make it start?
Can we trim the lights a little?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's gonna play, so let's don't worry about it. What I was gonna show you we're in a helicopter one day having put some batteries in one of these remote sensing units, and we're flying back over the face of one of these snouts of the glacier sticking into the fjord, when a chunk of ice 12 stories tall, bigger than any building in Vermont, just in the course of 3 or 4 seconds collapsed into the ocean with 50-foot waves coming up. And it just made me remember just how real all of this is and how quickly all of it is happening every passing day. I wrote the first book about all this stuff back in 1989, and back then it was still abstract and theoretical, but it is the furthest thing from that now. Someplace around the world, every single day, people are paying the price in big ways. They're often the people who did the least to cause the problem, but by now, climate change is so rampant around the planet that it's really starting to hit everybody. And we should keep in our minds today, probably, our countrymen in California, the people who evacuated that fire 3 weeks ago today are being evacuated because flash flooding has overtaken that whole region as record rainfalls come down on top of what was a record fire scar. I mean, this in California, which most of my life was kind of the vision of what the sort of idyllic world looked like, you know, the place that those of us who lived in spots like Vermont kind of thought about as, you know, what a sort of slight heaven on earth, you know, with and now where people breathe wildfire smoke weeks out of every year and keep bags packed by the front door at all times in case they have to leave in a matter of minutes, and so on and so forth. The other reason I wanted to just talk about Greenland for a minute and talk about that vision of that iceberg crashing down was to remind us that this is the first timed test that we've come across as a civilization. And one of the things I was trying to say last night to all these people at this sort of Sanders Institute gathering in Burlington was, don't bother coming up with solutions that work 75 or 100 years from now. It's going to take a minute. I don't know. Do you want to watch it? I'll just keep talking. Maybe we can turn down the sound because you don't really need to hear the helicopter. There we go. The pace and scale of this crisis is dictated by physics, okay, not by anything else, which means that whatever solution we come up with has to fit within the framework that physics has provided. And we're understanding now that that means that things have to happen with extraordinary rapidity. You've read these reports from the IPCC and now the federal government in the last few weeks. There's really nothing all that new in them. Scientists have been saying the same thing for a long time. They're saying it louder now because more and more time has passed, which means that the curve we have to travel gets steeper and steeper and steeper. In the world and in Vermont, when we said 90% by 2050 a long time ago, well, that curve wasn't that bad, but 2050, truthfully, is not that far. I mean, I know that you all are young people, and it's very hard to imagine the passage of another 32 years, but you know, it's happening with real speed, so we need to be reacting with real speed. There, keep an eye on that big chunk of ice right there that's beginning to let go. And again, that's bigger than the biggest building in Vermont.
Holy cow.
It's quite beautiful in its way.
Looks like a trade tower.
But when it goes down, you know, the ocean goes up some tiny fraction of an inch, and that happens every minute of every day around the frozen parts of this planet. All right, enough of this. Okay, I'm going to talk about stuff that's a little happier. Really what I want to do as a way of saying thanks to all of you for the incredible work that you're doing, town by town, county by county across Vermont, is just show you a little bit of who your brothers and sisters in this fight are around the world. Parts of this battle to prevent climate disaster sort of started in Vermont and there are plenty of people here in this room who were on that walk that we did in 2006, I think, up the west side of Vermont, where we ended up with 1,000 people walking into Burlington. And I remember Bernie, then running for the Senate, greeting us at the outskirts of Burlington as we came in, and Bernie was he was almost jumping up and down. He said, "Oh, this is so great. I haven't seen anything like this since Vietnam. This is so amazing. All these people. It's so great. What is this about again?" He, of course, has gone on to be the great champion of things climate in the Senate. We can be extraordinarily proud of his leadership. And that movement that sort of started in certain ways in Vermont and became 350.org that came out of Addison County has now spread around the world. And one of the things, I'll show you a few pictures right from the beginning of it, from the first day of action we did in 2008, which had 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries, what CNN called the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. One of the first things that I noticed as the pictures were flooding in, sometimes 10 and 20 a minute from around the world, was that I'd always been told that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and that if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and on and on and on. And just looking at the pictures, it was clear that this was completely nuts, that most of the people who are doing this work around the world, most of your brothers and sisters, are poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is composed of. And they're exactly as interested in the future as any of us, maybe more so because the future bears down very hard on you if you're in those places. People with great wit and great involvement of religious communities involved in troubled places. That's Jordan and Palestine and Israel. They couldn't all get together in one place because of the military boundaries, so they decided to do it like that along the Dead Sea. Back then, China was still building coal plants left and right. 10 years later, China's leading the world in the production of renewable energy, moving at a rapid scale now in very good ways. Those are our colleagues in the Maldives, the Student Government Association, holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate their existential problem as sea level rises. But they're not giving up, they're fighting. Indeed, people are fighting all over the world. There were a bunch of pictures that just ended up in a file called 350 Adorable. And they were very adorable, and they were sort of hard to look at. Those girls will be refugees, and not from something they did. So we've kept doing this. We've done, we think, 20,000 demonstrations in every corner of the world except North Korea. And some of them in obvious places, and some of them in places I'd never heard of, and places we knew for other reasons, and just all over the place, and huge art projects all over the world. That's one of those dry riverbeds in the Southwest. And for a few seconds as the satellite came over, 3,000 people lifted blue blankets up overhead just to bring the river back to life for a second. Wow. Had we 50 years to deal with this problem, I think that this kind of educational work is sort of what we would just keep doing, because human beings and human societies change best when they change slowly and gradually. That's the thing that makes most economic sense, most cultural sense. It's the least traumatic, so on. But as I said earlier, physics is in charge here, and physics is uninterested in where in the business cycle we are, or where in the electoral cycle. Physics just does what it does, and we don't have 50 years. We really had to start 50 years ago, and we didn't. So now we're way behind the 8 ball. We're obviously not going to stop climate change. That's not on the menu anymore. We've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree Celsius. If we do everything right, the temperature of the planet's going to go up pretty close to 2 degrees Celsius. We're on a path now for 3.5 or 4 degrees Celsius on current trajectories, 7, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. If we let that happen, we can't have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. I mean, that's not a planet that we can really exist on in our current form. So, along with education, we've had to learn to do a certain amount of confrontation too. And I actually wish we'd figured out how to do it sooner, and I wish we'd figured out how to kind of spread it sooner, because once we started, there were an extraordinary number of battles that we have managed together to win. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So, I mean, the Keystone Pipeline was the first big fight against new fossil fuel infrastructure when we began it in 2011. The National Journal, the kind of trade paper for in DC, polled their 300 energy insiders on the Hill, and in 2011, 93% of them said TransCanada would have its permit by the end of 2011 to build this pipeline. It's 2018 and it's not built yet, and that's 800,000 barrels of the dirtiest oil on earth a day that stays in the ground. That's useful, but the more useful thing was that it got things started. So that now, every time anyone tries to build a pipeline or a new coal mine or a fracking well or something, it gets fought. We don't win all those fights, though we win a surprising number of them. I'm always amazed by the fact that when one fights, one often wins. But in every case, we cause all kinds of trouble for the fossil fuel industry, who are, it must be said, the bad guys in this fight. I mean, bad guys in a very deep sense, one that we didn't understand even 10 years ago. It's been great investigative reporting over the last 3 or 4 years that's demonstrated beyond any doubt that the big fossil fuel companies knew everything there was to know about climate change in the 1980s. Knew it, scientists were studying it, they were ahead of the curve, knew it and believed it. They started building all their oil wells to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. The only thing they didn't do was tell any of us. Instead, they spent billions of dollars hiring the guys who used to work for the tobacco industry to make sure that the same kind of doubt and whatever uncertainty would spread. And they did their job well. I mean, the President of the United States is under the delusion that climate change was a hoax manufactured by the Chinese, which is something that if you heard someone muttering it on a public bus, you'd get up and move to another seat. But the head of the American Petroleum Lobby said in a speech to his colleagues last year, said somehow we have to stop the Keystoneization of everything that we're trying to build, which made my dark heart happy to hear, I must say. So it's been very good to watch that start to happen. I don't think, I mean, one of the things I most regret is that we didn't get it started quite soon enough on the west side of Vermont. And now we've got this unnecessary gas line running south down to Middlebury. Let's make sure that that's the last piece of dated, useless, archaic fossil fuel infrastructure we ever build in the state of Vermont. I signed that petition the minute I came in, and I hope other people will, because when you put something like that in, you're declaring that you're going to be using it for the next 40 or 50 or 60 years, and we just can't be doing that. The math doesn't allow it. So the good news is, I mean, whether or not we started in time is an open question. And these are a few pictures from our friends around the world who are demonstrating that climate change is already here. These people in Siberia, where we have forest fires now 5 degrees of latitude north of where we've ever had them before, because it just gets hot and dry, you know. People who have left their homes, in this case Micronesia, because the ocean now is where home used to be. Top red balloon is where the Dead Sea was 40 years ago. And these are the people in Pakistan who, I mean, Irene was bad, but the flood in Pakistan in 2010 was the biggest flood since Noah. The Indus River swelled to a point where it covered a quarter of the country. There were 20 million people out of their homes. Think about that for a minute. You know? I mean, that's like everybody from Boston to Baltimore having to evacuate. And you can tell by looking at them that they probably are not particularly responsible for the problem in which they find themselves enmeshed. So this resistance goes on everywhere. And there are moments that just stick in my mind in lots of ways. This was one of the smallest demonstrations I think anybody ever sent us a picture of. It was in Haiti, and it's just some street that's turned into a muddy river, but I just kept it in my mind for 2 reasons. One was the signs that those kids were holding. Your actions affect me, which is completely true. That city, Lake K, on the southwestern corner of Haiti, 2 years after this picture was taken, Lake K was essentially wiped from the map. 80% of its buildings destroyed as a hurricane came through. It was a hurricane that hit the Carolinas and did some damage, Matthew, I think. But it just was deadly and devastating in Haiti. I have no idea if those kids are still alive or not. Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's really nothing anyone in Haiti can do that affects the outcome of this. They can't burn less fossil fuel because they're not burning any now. They can't go to the gates of the White House and protest because we don't really let people into this country for those purposes or really any other anymore. They can't divest their stock holdings because I would guarantee that the entire investment portfolio of all of Haiti is considerably less than the pension fund for the state of Vermont, which for some reason we continue to refuse to divest, even now that the world's financial capitals, New York and London and Paris and things, have divested their fossil fuel holdings. Your actions affect me. That's a charge to be taken seriously, and that's why I'm so grateful to be with you all, because you've proven you do take it seriously and are doing the work day in, day out, for which we owe you enormous debt of gratitude. I mean, I could tell you stories about each of these pictures for a long time, and they're all fun. And one of the things that's been beautiful is to watch the ways that people have begun to form real coalitions. We talk a lot about climate justice and environmental justice, and one of the things that means in much of the world is that the people who are really leading this fight now are coming from the communities that are being hit hardest, and are coming particularly from indigenous communities around the planet, and it's very exciting to see that happen. These are pictures from one of the Keystone demonstrations. The ranchers in Nebraska and the Indian nations along the route of the pipeline were collaborating. They formed an outfit that they called the CIA, the Cowboy Indian Alliance. And they spent a good long time camped in DC and teepees and riding around on horses and having a good time, but it was extremely powerful in many ways. Among other things, the fact that people were able to cooperate, basically the sort of grandchildren of the people who stole the land from the people who used to have it, you know, and able to figure out how to work together. Simply the fact that the vision from the oldest wisdom traditions in the planet, indigenous traditions, and the newest wisdom traditions, the kind of scientific method, match up powerfully makes it a powerful moment. That the vision from the sweat lodge and the vision from the satellite and the supercomputer are in sync is extremely important. And they're in agreement over the fact that the kind of conventional wisdom for the last 100 years on this planet is not such a good idea. The idea that we're just going to keep growing forever and so on seems not to fit either the old way of looking at the world or the newest. We can mobilize huge numbers of people now sometimes. So, 400,000 people in New York City or all over the world or whatever. And I could show you pictures literally forever. I'm going to end, so we have time for a couple of questions, by showing you just a few pictures from some of my very favorite colleagues. These guys are in the Pacific Islands, and the Pacific Island nations that are, well, they're likely not to exist past the end of the century. Countries like Tuvalu, Vanuatu, the Marshalls, Micronesia, the Solomons, places that have been there where people living on them, deep, wonderful cultures that have lasted 5,000 years, 10,000 years, unlikely to make it through this century because literally, they're low to the water. They're a meter or two above sea level, which is a terrible place to be on a rapidly warming planet. But they are not giving up. Their slogan, our 350 Pacific crew, their slogan is, "We're not drowning, we're fighting." And they're fighting powerfully. One of the things they did a couple of years ago was on each of these islands, they built a canoe, a traditional canoe, different in each island, but and then they took them to, not that far away, to Newcastle in Australia, which is the biggest coal port in the world. More coal comes out through there than any place else on the planet. And they used these canoes for a day to blockade the biggest warships in the world and keep them in harbor. And it was an important thing. I mean, symbolic, obviously. The next day the ships were back carrying coal, but the effect on Australians was pretty profound. 2 months later, the city of Newcastle, which again, I tell you is the biggest coal port on earth, that's their economy, the city of Newcastle divested its public funds from any investments in fossil fuel. That is to say, the city of Newcastle is well ahead of the state of Vermont in this regard, okay? Because they were moved by that witness from their neighbors. It shouldn't really take that to happen at this point. We're in communication enough around the world that we should be able to figure some of this out ourselves, but it's really powerful when it happens. I want you, though, just to look at it, just to kind of, I'm a writer, and so, one of the things writers kind of understand is that there are a few tropes that recur throughout literature and that kind of stick in our heads, that we're sort of built for them. And one of them is this trope of the small and the many up against the big and the few, okay? That's our story in this climate fight. It's obviously very visual here. I mean, this is the Rebel Alliance against the Death Star, okay? And I was thinking of it because the next month there was a very similar picture emerged from our colleagues at 350 in Seattle. Seattle and Portland both were the scene for one of these great standoffs. Shell Oil had announced that it was going to go drill for oil in the Arctic. That's their 40-story drilling rig there in yellow. Simply that announcement is a sort of symbol of how insane, in a sense, we've become. I mean, 30 years ago, climate scientists told us that if we kept doing what we were doing, we would melt the Arctic. It turns out that they were correct. Shell Oil looked at the melting Arctic and did not say, perhaps we should go into the solar panel business instead, this isn't working out so well. They looked at it and said, now that it's melted, it'll be easier to drill for more oil, let's go do it. I mean, that calls into question the kind of idea that, the big brain was a good evolutionary adaptation, Happily, there were lots of people with perfectly good brains and big hearts connected to them that were willing to get in the way They got out in the harbor. We called them, of course, kayaktivists. And by the time the summer was over, they'd done enough brand damage to Shell that they pulled the plug on the whole thing. Said, we've spent $9 billion here, but we're not spending any more because we can't take this kind of damage that's coming from people in canoes in the way of our drilling rig. Let me just end by saying, we don't know how this is going to come out. We don't know if we're going to win this fight. And in a sense, we can't know because we haven't run this experiment before, you know. Which makes it hard to be the organizer in a sense that one should be. You know, the best thing would be to give you all a big pep rally and send you back out to do your important work. And I can't do it just because I'm by nature a writer. I don't know. Parts of the story are very dark. We've waited a long time to get started. The physics is not good. But the fact that over the last 10 years, the engineers have done their job with such power that they've brought the cost of renewable energy down to the point where it's perfectly cheap and acceptable way to power our lives. And the fact that people have risen up all over the world to form movements to do something about it, those are things that should leave one I find myself not in a position of despair, but in a position of engagement, okay? I'm not going to tell you we're going to win. I will tell you that it is worth fighting because we don't know the outcome. In fact, it's the most important fight that humans have ever gotten into, and every one of you every day is doing things that change the odds in that fight a little bit. And as you do that, because the stakes are so high, they're no less than the only planet we've got, you're doing extraordinarily important work for which many, 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 many thanks. It's a real pleasure to get to be with you all today. Thank you.